All right. So next up, thank you for your patience. Next up, we have Debenham, developer of Shattered Pixel Dungeon, which I know I enjoy, and so does Kawa. So going to be talking about community-driven roguelikes, which is appropriate since we were just talking about community. And yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Evan.
Thank you very much, Alexi. So yeah, my presentation is on community-driven roguelike development. Specifically, I'm going to talk a bit about my experiences working on Shattered Pixel Dungeon and how it came from the Pixel Dungeon community, has been influenced by it, and how it involves it in its development process. So firstly, let's talk about how the game started from Pixel Dungeon. Pixel Dungeon is a traditional roguelike, by most definitions, that tries to be a bit more approachable. It has pleasant pixel art graphics instead of ASCII. It has a fairly simple tap and click-based interface that works well on both phones and computers. And it has less upfront complexity than many roguelikes, but it's still got a lot of stuff that can be engaging. It's very much a coffee break roguelike, and it's inspired by Brogue. Pixel Dungeon was originally made using Java for Android, but it was eventually ported to the libgdx game library and is now available on iOS and desktop computers as well. It was made by Oleg Dolya, also known as Wannaboo, and it was pretty successful. It spawned a whole bunch of communities, which I'll talk about in a second, and has over 5 million downloads on Google Play, as one example. So Shattered Pixel Dungeon is a game that I make based on Pixel Dungeon's open source code. It originally started as a balance modification, but has slowly become its own game. And its main goal has been to expand on Pixel Dungeon while still staying true to its roots. It's been going for 7 years now, and almost all of the content in Pixel Dungeon is overhauled. It's also been pretty successful, so much so that it's now my full-time job. The 2 screenshots we have here are from the game's main interface and a typical scene you might see right after starting a game. Let's go back to Pixel Dungeon here for a second for comparison. You can see that there's a lot that's similar, but a lot has changed as well. So Pixel Dungeon has spawned a bunch of different communities. There is a subreddit with over 17,000 members, a wiki with over 1,000 pages, a Discord with over 2,000 members, and several non-English communities too, such as in Russia, South Korea, and China. You can see here 3 examples of pictures of logos, of 3 of those communities. The subreddit on the left, the wiki in the center, and the Discord on the right. These communities were Shattered Pixel Dungeon's launching point. After an AMA, or Ask Me Anything, on the Pixel Dungeon subreddit, Wannaboo decided to make Pixel Dungeon open source. At the time, I was working a regular computer science internship and realized that if I wanted to get started making games, I needed to do it soon. So the game going open source seemed like an amazing opportunity for me to get my feet wet. Originally, I was just going to modify the game's balance, tweak a few items that I thought were over or underpowered. And the name Shattered Pixel Dungeon came from an old blog I had called Shattered Pixel, and the fact that I was shattering Pixel Dungeon's balance. The initial reaction from the community was overwhelming. The first release was just on the Pixel Dungeon subreddit, and clearly the community was really, really thirsty for more Pixel Dungeon content, because the response I got on the subreddit was so overwhelmingly positive that I decided to release on Google Play way ahead of schedule. The first release was 0.2.0, and it got over 100,000 downloads within a month. This meant that Shattered completely blew past the obscurity problem that many new games face. You can see on the right there a little graph showing the new downloads Shattered Pixel Dungeon had right after its original release. You might think that that huge spike is all the Pixel Dungeon community, but actually the community itself was that smaller growth up to the spike before it. What happened was the attention from the Pixel Dungeon communities caused the game to rank well on Google Play's listings, which exposed it to a greater audience. The Pixel Dungeon community was quite literally a springboard to Shattered Pixel Dungeon's early exposure. And over the years, Shattered has grown with the community. That huge response, as I mentioned, meant Shattered kept growing. It became a complete overhaul eventually after several years, far from the original intention of it being just a balance mod. Because of my activity on the subreddit, I became the sole administrator, and eventually I also started a Discord. Over time, these communities grew in size, And eventually I was able to take a step back and no longer be the sole admin or moderator. I've also started a dedicated blog website for Shattered as well, ShatteredPixel.com, which has links both back to the subreddit and also a news feed in the game. In this way, I'm trying to pull people from Shattered Pixel Dungeon into the greater Pixel Dungeon community. Over the years, Shattered and the PD communities have grown together. And it's important to note that I'm not the only person who's taken the source code of Pixel Dungeon. There are hundreds of other Pixel Dungeon variants, which range from tiny tweaks to huge gameplay overhauls like Shattered. And while some of them are developed more sporadically than others, there's always going to be something new if you want to play a version of Pixel Dungeon that isn't Shattered. Shattered and these various versions have kept Pixel Dungeon and its community alive for years after Pixel Dungeon's final update in 2015. Here are some of the logos of some of the most popular Pixel Dungeon versions. From left to right, we have Remix Dungeon, Yet Another Pixel Dungeon, Skillful Pixel Dungeon, Sprouted Pixel Dungeon, Moonshine Pixel Dungeon, and Soft Pixel Dungeon. So now that we know where the game started from, I'm going to talk a bit about how the game has iteratively improved over the years through my update philosophy. Shattered does what I call iterative updates. I release an update for Shattered about every 2 to 3 months, and these updates usually have a primary focus plus some content on the side. Over the years, I've released 10 major and 28 minor updates to the game since 2014. These major updates used to take 6 months or more, but now I try to break them up into more manageable chunks so that pretty much every update hits that 2 to 3 month target. You can see at the bottom here a timeline of Shattered's major updates. So why do I do this? Iterative updates are easier to plan and design and help limit feature creep. I can still try to create some bigger overarching thing, but at the end of the day, anything I make has to be split into 2 to 3 month long deliverables. This helps keep a great balance between the short term and the long term. 2 to 3 months is big enough to be able to continually work towards something bigger, but is small enough that there's always something new, keeping the players engaged. I have people who've been dedicated to Shattered since 2014, and I think a big part of that is because if they put the game down for a few months, there'll always be something new to come back to. There's also a lot of room for experimentation and course correction with this strategy. If you want to try something and the update doesn't quite work, the absolute worst case scenario is that you lose 2 months of work. Not great, but not disastrous. But more importantly, it means that I can always go back and revisit an update and make changes or corrections. This frequently happens in an update following the previous one. So what actually does go into an update? As I mentioned, there's major content, things like overhauls to large gameplay mechanics or categories of items. There can also be minor changes and improvements, things like a complete overhaul to a specific item or a specific character. A specific enemy, rather. A player character rework would be a major content overhaul. There could also be balance adjustments, buffing or nerfing various items to try to keep the game more fair. And of course, there are quality of life tweaks and bug fixes too. On the right here, you can see an example of Shattered Pixel Dungeon's changes screen. Instead of just having a big wall of text, and after 7 years it would be a huge wall of text, I tried to make the changes screen a little bit more bite-sized and interactive. Every single one of those icons can be clicked to show more details about what that specific thing has changed in this update. This way, the changes scene still provides full detail, but can fit onto a phone screen and isn't overwhelming at first glance. But you might ask, how do I decide what to actually change or tweak? How do I know a particular thing is underpowered or overpowered or unpopular? I have 2 major sources of feedback that I use to work into this iterative update model. The first thing is gameplay analytics. Shattered Pixel Dungeon is primarily a mobile game at the moment, so I use Google's Firebase library. This provides me with crash and error reports, engagement data, such as how many players are playing the game and in what areas, and gameplay data, such as what items or characters are being used and what their success rates are. Importantly, no personal information is collected. This is not an advertising tool. This means that players are free to help development of the game just by playing it, and there's no detriment to them. As an example of this, I might pull in a bunch of information about a new item that's been added to the game. I'll see how many players take that item and invest something like a scroll of upgrade into it compared to all the other items in its class. I can then see, of the runs that have invested in that item, how often do they win? Using this, I can come up with a somewhat objective evaluation of how powerful particular items are. It's important to note, though, that while this data is objective, it can be misused. You can easily mistake correlation for causation. For example, the very high-tier weapons in the game have really high win rates, but not because they're massively stronger, but because players tend to only invest in them at the later stages of the game. Also, very importantly, while I do pride myself on all of the mechanics in Shattered Pixel Dungeon being viable, just because all the numbers are the same doesn't mean that a game is actually fun. So speaking of gameplay feel and fun, the second major point of feedback is, of course, feedback from the players themselves. I get player feedback from a bunch of different channels, including emails, messages on the various Pixel Dungeon communities, and even reviews in app stores like Google Play. I feel like the most valuable thing this feedback provides is perspective. When you're working on your own game, it's really easy to become your own echo chamber and end up working only on things that you want and that you like. And while your perspective is important, the perspective of all your other players is too. So by constantly pulling in feedback from other people, you can kind of temper your own perspective and broaden it so that you're making a game for more people. Importantly, though, players can be biased too, and sometimes your most dedicated players can have the most biased perspectives. That doesn't mean their feedback is worthless. You just need to recognize when they have particular biases and account for them. One way in particular that I think works really well is when players want to give a specific suggestion about something in the game. Don't take their suggestion at face value, but instead try to understand the desire behind the suggestion and try to address that. As a somewhat funny example, I have on a few occasions, I'm serious, had players suggest that I add Sans from Undertale as a boss to Shattered Pixel Dungeon. And while obviously that on the surface is ridiculous, the very real piece of desire behind that is that the players want more interesting and engaging boss fights, and that is something I can do. And finally, one other important part of feedback is getting that feedback early. Every single update that Shattered has an open public beta that lasts for at least a week. During the beta, I do things like quickly fix critical issues. Generally, betas are stable after about a day. I'll finish up any outstanding game content, gather feedback, and make any critical tweaks based on that feedback. And also, because Shattered Pixel Dungeon has a translation project, this gives the translators time to help translate all of the new content in the game. Importantly, this means that, effectively, my players are my QA. And when you have a very big multi-million-dollar game studio, you've probably heard the complaint, your players shouldn't be your QA. I think that makes a lot of sense for really big game studios. But for smaller independent developers, as long as we're honest about it, I think it's a really, really great symbiotic relationship to offer your players your content a little early in exchange for them helping you shape it and fix issues in it. In particular, from a development speed standpoint, it also means that I don't have to just frankly waste time testing content over and over and over and over again. The players can do that for me. So that's a lot of talk about the little details, but what about the bigger overall design? Well, obviously game design in general isn't the point of this presentation. I am going to go over to two particular things. The first is designing for interaction. And every single time I try to add something to Shattered, I try to contextualize it in terms of how the player interacts with the game and how the game interacts with the player. And so I want to create new and interesting ways for those interactions to occur, both in terms of the player interfacing with the game through their hero mechanics or their items, and also the game interacting with the player through the environment, obstacles, and enemies. One major thing I found is that active, engaging effects that impact player decision-making are way more fun, generally, than passive ones. Giving players, say, a +1 to damage, for example, isn't that interesting. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a place, though, of course, because not everything can be really complex and interesting, as too much complexity can be confusing. Secondly, speaking of complexity, I like to think of Shattered's game systems in terms of layers. Shattered will have things like the core tap-based gameplay at the very base, and then there can be things like consumable and equipment items on top of that, then the abilities of the hero and their enemies, and advanced gameplay strategies, or the structure of the level itself and hazards in it like traps, and all sorts of other things. The idea here is that each of these layers is not that complicated in and of itself, but all the layers interact with each other to create a really deep, interesting experience. Crucially, I think this is one of the reasons why Shattered Pixel Dungeon still feels so much like Pixel Dungeon, because I haven't really done much to change those core layers. That basic tap-based gameplay is still the foundation of the game. You can see here 2 screenshots that I think demonstrate this. On the left, you have a screenshot in the early stages of the game. The player only has one enemy, which doesn't have many complicated mechanics to it, and really all they have to do is tap on them to defeat them. On the right here, we have a much more complex scene much later in the game. The player now has all sorts of items. In particular here, they have a Staff of Fire Blast, which they're using against a boss monster, and that boss has all sorts of mechanics of its own as well. The idea is that core tap to move here or do this gameplay is still there, but there's so much more going on top of it. So with those design tenets in mind, how do I actually create development plans for the game? Well, firstly, planning is important, even with an iterative update model, because I have to think more than one update in advance. I need a long-term direction to contextualize all these updates in, and the players want to know what's coming in the far future. Ultimately, my plans are a mixture of my own ideas and community sentiment. Some plans are part of my own design mixed with feedback from players. For example, I recently created a new complexity layer, if you want, to the game, the talent system for the heroes. Many players told me that hero leveling up wasn't very interesting, either through suggestions or other types of feedback. And so in response to that, I created a system where the player gets points every time their hero levels up, and they can spend those points on all kinds of interesting abilities, some of which change their decision-making. Another example, to go back to that more interesting bosses discussion I mentioned, is a couple of years ago now, 7 years, it feels recent if it's a couple of years old, I recently overhauled all of the enemies and bosses in the game, again, to increase interaction in many cases. But there have been some ideas that are almost completely community-driven, such as the game's translation project. I helped set some things up on a technical level, but for the most part, the players do all of the translation work on their own. So with those long-term plans, I personally think it's really important to share those. So I have, as I mentioned, a website, ShatteredPixel.com, where I write about 12 blog posts a year at the moment. And these share a lot of my grander, longer-term plans with the player base. The idea here is firstly to get players excited. Secondly, it helps me be a bit more concrete about my own ideas. But thirdly, it also means that it gets players talking about the things I'm planning, which means that I can gather feedback on upcoming content before I've even released it. And finally, it's really important to note that while Shattered is primarily a solo-developed game, I've definitely gotten some help along the way. Some examples of this are splash arts by Alexander Komatov, music from Christian Haristo, sound effects from Charlie, those translations from the community, and of course, on a more technical level, the libgdx Java game library, which has allowed the game to release on new platforms, and the original Pixel Dungeon source code that made all of this possible. Unfortunately, most of these things aren't really too visual, so it's a little hard for me to show them to you, but I can showcase the hero splash arts, which I think are really great. I'm just going to leave these up for a few moments, so you can appreciate them. So, finally, how have I made all of this sustainable and a career, as I mentioned previously? In my opinion, this is the most valuable thing the community has given me. But before we get into that, let me quickly say how mobile games usually make money. Generally, a mobile game will make money either through advertisements or microtransactions. Advertisements are things like banners that pop up on the top of the screen during gameplay, or full screen ads during pauses in gameplay. The goal with them is to generate a consistent amount of small revenue from every player. Microtransactions, on the other hand, generally will charge the user to access advantages in the game or to speed gameplay up. And their goal is to create a large amount of revenue from a small number of players. Unfortunately, both of these things don't work at all for Shattered because they're disruptive to the gameplay experience. Advertisements take away screen real estate from the game and can have privacy concerns. And microtransactions can cheapen the gameplay, which is especially problematic for a roguelike that's supposed to be challenging. And most importantly, the community would be outraged if I did one of these things. The original Pixel Dungeon sets a precedent for a 100% offline game with no monetization. The original Android version of the game has a tiny little donate button in the main screen, and that's it. Nothing is tied to real-world money. And importantly, Shattered is open source, so anyone could take my code and compete with me, something that many players may want to do if I start to sell out or similar. So because of this, any monetization has to be non-disruptive. I've done 3 major things toward this. The first, in 2015, was a supporter purchase system. I added cosmetic microtransactions with the branding of supporting the game. These are cosmetic and mild convenience features, like gravestones with custom epitaphs for fallen heroes, the ability to rename your characters and items, extra screens on the game's rankings page, and recolors to the game's interfaces. The idea here is that they're focused on small, fun little extras that don't detract from the gameplay experience by cheapening the game if you buy them, or by making you feel like you miss out if you don't buy them. In 2019, I opened another blogging channel through Patreon. The blog has bonus content that's separate from the game entirely, focusing on behind-the-scenes information. It's basically a souped-up version of ShatteredPixel.com. I write weekly mini-blogs, there's monthly content polls, an exclusive Discord, etc. This requires constant effort to upkeep, but I can integrate it with the writing I do for the blog. Importantly, this also provides a community for the game's most dedicated players, outside of the public ones. And most recently, just selling the game. Shattered Pixel Dungeon recently released on the iOS App Store for $5. I did this for a couple reasons. Firstly, the original Pixel Dungeon was already $3 on the App Store, and I couldn't undercut it. Apple also has higher platform fees that I have to offset, and Apple users are just more willing to buy a game up front. Shattered Pixel Dungeon also released with 7 years of content already complete. By comparison, when Shattered originally released on Google Play, it was basically just the original Pixel Dungeon with a couple of tweaks. And I also included some supporter benefits in the game as a bonus. So, which one of these was most important? Personally, I think all 3 of them played a role. The cosmetic microtransactions were good money, but that money was dependent on the quality of the game. I wouldn't have kept getting revenue from them if I didn't keep updating. However, they were easy to set up. There was nothing I had to do after implementing the direct features. The Patreon, on the other hand, required consistent effort to upkeep, but also gave me community benefits. The Patreon does, however, require a decent number of people to sign up. It's not really very compelling having an exclusive community if there's only 1 or 2 people in it. And finally, just selling the game. I only have 2 months of data, but so far this looks like it's going to be the best sustainability feature of the game by a lot. However, it was also the hardest to set up. The game has to be worth buying in the first place. I could definitely not have started selling the game 7 years ago. So in my mind, all 3 of these have built on each other, and none of them was extraneous or unnecessary. And one little thing to mention, you may have already seen this if you looked at the Steam sale. Following the release on the App Store, I'm looking to release a PC version early next year as well, continuing on that success working with new platforms. The plan is to release it under a pay-what-you-want model on itch.io, with $10 as a suggested amount, and $10 directly on Steam, with those supporter benefits included. The game does need more work for this, though. It's just like the other forms of monetization, it's not easy to just do right away. Currently, the game on desktop is a straight mobile port, and I think that there are changes I need to make to the interface and keyboard and controller support in order for desktop users to feel like they're first-class citizens. So, in conclusion, Shattered is a little different perhaps from other games, but definitely not unique. It started as a modification but grew into its own game. There are several easy examples of this with Valve properties, like Team Fortress, Counter-Strike, and Dota. Its popularity was gained through an existing audience, which is true of most modifications, fan games, and even sequels. And it was self-published. There are some extremely successful games that have been self-published, like Minecraft and Undertale, and plenty of roguelikes and lights as well, such as Binding of Isaac and Dwarf Fortress. All of these games may seem really different from each other, but there's one thing they all have in common, and that's the power of community. Every single one of these games, to some degree, owes either its initial success or its continued success towards community involvement. And I don't just mean people being willing to play the game. I mean people going above and beyond that, making their own content based on the game, participating in online communities, helping the game grow beyond just its gameplay. And I think that that is the biggest reason Shattered Pixel Dungeon has been successful. So, what did I do in particular for community? I helped get people engaged by leveraging and helping grow the existing Pixel Dungeon community. I created a blog and extra content channels for the game as well. I iteratively improved the game through frequent, smaller updates that were more flexible and easier to make. This let me easily integrate player feedback and data so I can course correct when I did make mistakes. And I tried my best to identify long-term goals based on a mixture of my own game design goals and community sentiment. And this has allowed me to steadily grow Shattered Pixel Dungeon and its audience and turn it into a sustainable career. Thank you very much for listening. I think we have just a little bit of time if there are any questions.
We do have a little bit. Thank you so much, Evan. It's really great. Mobile kind of roguelike development is something that we haven't really been able to showcase much here before. So we really appreciate you taking the time to talk.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, of course. The first question that I think is a really solid one is from Darren Gray, which is, how do you manage default negativity towards any change from veterans?
Oh, that's a very good one, actually. So this is actually a recent example of that, the new music in the game. Rather than having the old music and then just add new stuff and have a kind of a weird rift in music styles, Christian and I opted instead to remake the game's existing tracks, which have been in the game for almost a decade now. Ultimately, when it comes to these things, you have to, at least what I have done, is accounted for the fact that there's going to be some change resistance. There will be players who will just say, I hate this, change it back. Why is it different? And you just sort of have to take it. And I know that's not necessarily very helpful if it's something new for you, because you might not know what's the acceptable amount of dislike. But in my own experiences, there is a noticeable difference between change resistance and the community genuinely not liking something.
Right, and so I suppose it's kind of experience to pick up on that difference.
I suppose one thing to note is what are they saying aside from just being upset? Is it, please change it back, or are they giving you actionable reasons why they dislike the new thing?
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe one other quick question of the 2 minutes we have from Cuttlefish Man. You mentioned earlier how you occasionally run up against stuff that's unfun but is balanced. Can you talk about an example of that?
Well, I think so. If you want to say it from a numbers perspective, one of the scariest things that you can see for the numbers is something like an item with very, very low usage but very, very high win rate. Because that means there's something that's preventing the players from using that item frequently, but when they use it, it's very, very good. Or similarly, if something has extremely high win rates, but the player feedback you're getting isn't that it has very high win rates. When there's that kind of big disagreement between player sentiment and the numbers, there's got to be a reason for that. So at least from an analytics and feedback standpoint, you have to identify why that's happening and then try to account for it. And most commonly for me in Shattered Pixel Dungeon, it's when there are big sources of passive power. When there's something like an item, like just as an example, say an item that makes the player regain their health more quickly. That's not very visual. The player isn't really going to notice when they get little bits of health, but it makes a big, big difference to how likely they are to beat the game.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. And yeah,
again, a lot of it comes back to interaction. That's
right.
From my experience, the most surefire way to make something fun is to have it change the way the player wants to interact with things.
Yeah. I think that ties nicely into earlier talks we've had too about even, questions about juiciness of like, what actually do you feel in terms of the way the game's playing out.